Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin.
For this episode, I was thinking about this overly used meme by Dan Ariely, which says, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone claims they are doing it. So I think for data contracts or any other trend or buzzwords, this is really quite relevant.
Just before, when you say, this image and feel like that, I was like, I'm going to take a note of it so we can include it in in the description. You say teenager sex and feel like that. I was like, I don't know if we include that.
Yeah, sorry. This is the first thing that came to mind about data contracts because we have never implemented it.
This is us discovering actually this topic. We never had a hands-on experience when it comes to data contracts. We're really curious because we're hearing about this topic on LinkedIn, on some other podcasts, but this is pretty much a green field on our side. So we might say things were totally wrong, and I'm pretty sure it's evolving very rapidly as well. We might learn from the community, from anyone listening. You can basically comment or send us a message on LinkedIn or Twitter if you don't agree or if you agree with some of what we said.
And one of the reasons of doing these episodes is also to bring awareness to the community. This happened with the data observability one a couple of weeks ago. I got contacted by so many people about, I didn't know that this was so important. Mm-hmm. So definitely this is something that, as you mentioned, is a trend. And that is really worth exploring.
Definitely. So should we define what is data contracts?
Yes, let's get started. So let's take a step back because I think most of us have been in the situation where you come to work just to realize that your data pipelines fail. And after doing a bit of logging and exploration, you realize that the entire data pipeline failed because in the source system, someone added a new column. Someone changed the data type of a column, or even worse, someone just dropped the column completely. Now, this actually happens because those systems are what is called tightly coupled. So you have a source and a destination that they are expecting the data in a specific way. And if it's not the case, then everything just breaks. And this is the premise of data contracts, basically. So simply put, data contracts are API-like agreements between software engineers who own the services and data consumers that understands how the business works, which in my opinion are the data engineers, the data analysts creating model data, creating dashboards, reporting, ML. Mm-hmm. And this interface in the middle, that API, which is the contract, is the one that is meant to enforce that all this agreement on how I expect in the data is actually fulfilled. Now, what actually this creates is that this allows the software engineer to decouple their databases and services from those analytical and ML requirements.
Yeah.
Right. And what this brings is actually avoiding things to break when things changes. Now, this is the most simplistic way of seeing this. We are going to deep dive later on this episode. But I don't know. What do you think? In your opinion, do you think this is for every single pipeline?
I guess it has to be at least for organization who want to implement, it's going to be very laser focus on high value data pipeline, the one who are the most critical, the one when, as we were speaking last week with Alex Eskenazi, the one who are actually tied to customers paying for the data to some aspect. Because a contract that define a set of rules, an agreement between the data producers and data consumers. So that's why, in my point of view, this will really address those very narrow use cases to start.
This is a really good point that you raised there, because One important thing to mention here from the technology implementation perspective is the fact that this exists in some ways already with software vendors. For example, Salesforce, right? If Salesforce is going to introduce changes into their API, they'll tell you that, there is going to be a version 2, version 2.5, version 3 of this API to avoid making breaking changes in production, right? But within the organization, this is not something that happens very often. And what it actually brings is that this becomes not only technology change, but also an organizational change, because there are now points of contact for every source system because an agreement exists. And also you get a bit better ways to monitor all of your pipelines in one single place.
Exactly, yeah. Because here we're really speaking of the fact that data teams are now becoming more organized, obviously, across organization. They're becoming bigger. And there is a reckoning that with a multiplicity of tools being used in an organization, with a multiplicity of skill sets that people are developing, and the increasing use, obviously, of data across internal parts of the organization, being consumed by much more people, we're seeing those data issues. We're seeing those needs to formalize more what data should look like for X, Y, Z use case. And that's where the emergence of data contract is relevant.
Yep.
And it's important, as you've been saying, Christian, you might have external service providers, so third-party data in this case. You have SLA, you have a contract because you're buying a service, you're buying some level of service from this company. But internally, what is the actual SLA? What is actually what you can expect from the different systems that are producing the data, transforming the data, etc. So that will be what we can call actually first-party data. And that the idea of data contract is actually to cover those kind of first-party data use cases here.
100%. And I think now we can start talking about the different types of data contracts that exist.
Yeah, we discovered that in some aspects here. When I read, I saw like two major types. Maybe you might have another one, I don't know, but there is data contract that focusing on the schema. So schema contracts, basically. And it's basically saying what is the structure of the data that should be exchanged in this case. And the second one is a service contract. And this is the one we are most used to in some aspect. And that really defines the rules, the business logic potentially, the business expectation potentially inside, some expectation on SLA, some expectation on definition of metrics maybe, and also as part of a contract who is accountable in those aspects, who should maintain, who should be contacted, etc. I don't know if you have any other type of contract you will see. I don't know actually if we can and we should define and split those contracts like that.
Actually, yeah, I mean, that's a good one. I don't really have one. As you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this is quite new.
Yeah.
But I would say that the schema ones are the ones that are there for disruption in the industry, in my opinion. As you pointed out, the ones that we are quite used to it are the ones that are related to SLAs, to
focusing only on that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that we don't need to lose track that data contracts that we're talking about today are a technology implementation, right? So there is no product as such as, I install something that will create me a data contract, but there is a technology that needs to be put in place in order to create these data contracts, which I think are the ones that we should drill down into and pay close attention to it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting to see all different data tools, business tools, are implementing some parts of those expectations. We were aware of data catalogs that are fully like considers this kind of aspect where you have a full taxonomy of the data, some expectation where we write about to the user, like what is the expected freshness of the data, etc., who is responsible for the data set, etc. Likewise, this kind of information can be passed automatically through APIs to business intelligence tool, for example. So there is some already a certain level of integration, but it's quite loosely integrated here. It hasn't been well defined, basically. It's different tools who thought like, oh, that's actually relevant to add this kind of information.
I agree. And you can see how this lack of definition really has created this niche. Even if you remember our episode with Dennis, the first thing that he mentioned as the biggest pain point was data quality, right? That he spent so much time looking at cleaning the data, making sure that the data is fresh, making sure that the data is fit for analysis, and how much time consuming these data quality tasks were actually.
But on this point, like you highlighting some of the reasons why data contracts are important, like for things not breaking, touching on data quality and things like that. That really helps to, in my point of view, in an organization who is growing in terms of data usage, data teams, it really helps to standardize many processes across the organization on that. We can think as well in this case that means it's going to help to reduce the cost and complexity for these data integration projects overall. It's going to help like create efficiency, going to create like frameworks in terms of data interoperability. Yep. Hopefully I pronounced correctly this word. So this is providing a great framework for all organizations to that extent.
Quick one. If you're enjoying this episode and our show, please make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Links are in the description as per usual.
Also, if you'd like to grow this community with us, think about sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague interested about all things data.
Now, back to the episode.
So from your perspective, from your reading and discussion, what do you think is the best way to implement data contracts?
So, disclaimer, the best way that I have seen this implemented is based on an article by Chad Sanderson and Adrian Krusiger. I hope I pronounced his last name correctly. And this is for a CDC-based implementation of data contracts. CDC meaning change data capture, integration between systems.
And disclaimer number 2, this is actually quite a technical topic and heavy. So sorry if you're not able to follow everything in this episode compared to what we usually discuss in previous episodes of this podcast.
Yes, we will do our best on this one. And just to have everyone on the same page, CDCs are replications for every single create, update, delete operation from one system to the next one. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is meant to be a near real-time type of integration. So in terms of how the data contract was implemented, it was done by 4 key steps. First, you define the data contract, which is the place where you define your schema. Second, you create a data contract enforcement, which this is basically applying integration tests and data quality. Step number 3, you create a data contract fulfillment, which is a part where you process those CDC events to make sure that the schema matches the previously defined data contract. And finally, number 4 is the data contract monitoring. Now, why this data contract is interesting is because a CDC type of replication is what we were discussing as tightly coupled, right? So you have the source database system and the target database system actually not catering for changes into the schema. So this is quite a popular type of replication, but at the same time, quite prone to error when it comes to this schema evolution or schema handling of changes.
You explain defining the data contract, where it's pretty much what is a schema expected, but within this contract, adding like some data quality expectation. That means down the line in the enforcement phase is pretty much like doing those kind of quality check, which can be done at different levels in a data pipeline here. I mean, pretty much it should be rather later stage before like being available to data consumers. But this could be done at different levels.
That is correct. So if we drill down into these 4 key steps, as you mentioned, steps number 1 and 2 are all about defining the schema. And the definition goes in both ways. You can think about it in documentation, but also in an Avro file format. And the reason for that is because the Avro file format actually gives you the schema separate from in that binary file, right? So that's step 1. Actually, that's just job done, right? Now, number 2, as you mentioned, is that data quality piece, right? Is where you create those unit tests that make sure that the contract rules, all the expectations are actually done, and that, as you mentioned, can be done in different steps within the pipeline. Now, step number 3, the fulfillment, that is actually quite interesting. So this is the place where you create that implementation that will handle version 1, version 2, version 3 of your API. And the way that this architecture that Chad Sanderson proposed was by using 2 different Kafka topics. So one is receiving the events, and the second one is processing those changes and making sure that that schema evolution changes matches what the initial contract was created. Again, this is something that it needs to be seen a bit more in detail. There is a GitHub repository. This has been all developed using open source tooling. But the fulfillment, to me, is the key here, is the actual way of creating that API that consumers will subscribe to.
So you're pretty much saying that there is a side data quality check being done at a specific level to basically check if against the contract is being correct or not. And it's on the side of the data pipeline.
You can put it that way, yes. And we will put also the link on the description for everyone to see this implementation, this architecture. But one important thing about data contracts is that they're public. So they are not, for example, meant to be one-to-one integrations, but rather something that everyone can subscribe to. And I think that's really cool. And that's how you really decouple your database and
advantage.
Yes, you take advantage from this implementation. I think that's really unique, though. Now, finally, number 4, monitoring. I think that's very self-explanatory, but this is the place where you bring that extra layer of understanding about how your pipelines are performing, but also you bring that extra observability into your pipelines to get a full understanding of all of those events and how they behave.
Is basically recorded and can be, in terms of audits, providing like a way to track that.
Correct.
Backdated. No, backdated is not the right way to say it, but go back in time and being able to like figure out what happened at different point in time. Yeah.
Yes, and just to summarize, to implement this data contract, you go by first defining the schema. Second, you specify how you're going to enforce the data contract using unit tests and data quality checks. Number 3, you implement a process that makes sure that the contract will be fulfilled and that there is not going to be any breaking changes. And finally, you define your monitoring of your contract to have greater observability.
So in terms of use cases now, one example that can come to my mind, actually, I don't know how much is implemented, but when we think about between different countries, different governments, all those different agreements they put in place to share information about tax of citizens between different countries, or between like speed tickets we might get between different countries. This is, in my point of view, a great analogy to those kind of data contracts, because in those type of agreements, governments might not have the same tools to track this information, to process this information, but they agree on the specific exchange mechanism and on specific responsibilities between them. And that's, in my point of view, a fantastic analogy when we think about data contracts and here in the space more of government, let's say.
I think you just did an amazing analogy, as you mentioned. I think you touch on the reasons why you would use a data contract, which is you want to assess how data behaves on the fly, on real time. As you're collecting data, you want to know, for example, those bid tickets are conforming with a certain set of rules, and also you avoid breaking changes by introducing the contract, meaning that if one specific country changes the schema, it doesn't break it for the other countries that are expecting the data in a certain shape or form. And you're also applying this to improve discoverability, right? I mean, you're looking at your speed tickets from your country, and perhaps other countries will have that ability to take a look at what happened on that API. So yeah, I wouldn't bring any other use case. I think you nailed that one. But one of the things that comes to mind when we talk about data contracts or this trend is that you want to introduce this, yes, to avoid data quality, spending a lot of time doing data quality checks, but at the same time, you don't want to slow down your development, right? Because I think that's one of the caveats that I see, meaning that putting all of these systems in place before starting actually developing something new, I don't know, I feel like...
Oh my God, it's not easy. I mean, this is such a... I realize more and more it's such a novel topic.
Yeah.
We touch very on something like... I think we're really into the data space, you and me. When we come to this level of discussing new trend where there is no yet like extremely well structured, it's like only being created at the moment, I feel. So it's a bit difficult to discuss about it.
Yeah, we need a takeaway though.
Yeah, so for everyone listening, Christian and I, let's be honest, we've been a bit struggling to grasp first the importance of data contract, but all to define it, or to explain it as simple as we can. But we realize how important data contract could be and will be in the future in one form or another. This is basically the concept, the idea of data contracts. Not as a direct piece of technology per se. From our reading, there is no clear yet defined technology on data contracts. So
agree. And this is an evolving space. So I really see that anyone that would like to start trying this will benefit from it, right? That I think it's just a fact. And as you just mentioned, data contracts will be even more important because this space just keeps growing and growing.
I feel both of us will monitor that quite closely, I'm pretty sure. And we will have another episode like on the topic, maybe having a guest in a few months discussing that specifically.
I couldn't agree more.
And with that, well, that was a fantastic episode, Christian.
Agree, Mark. Can't wait for the next one. Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday, and until then, keep your data caffeinated.